The Mandalorians were known for many things, but above all else, they were known for their distinctive armor. To a Mandalorian, their armor was one of their most valued possessions, an important cultural identifier, as well as a useful piece of equipment, one of the things that made them Mandalorian. Traditionally made of lightsaber-resistant beskar steel, Mandalorian armor was durable, highly protective, and often packed full of other useful gadgets. There were many nuances to this iconic set of equipment, some of which were widely known and some of which were much more obscure. In this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the galaxy's most iconic armor, examining every little detail of the traditional Mandalorian Supercommando kit.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Mandalorian armor, also known as beskar'gam or iron skin in Mando'a, was central to the Mandalorian way of life, and it had been from the beginning. Wearing armor was one of the resolner, or the 6 duties that all Mandalorians were expected to perform all their lives. The duties that made Mandalorians Mandalorian. Beskar'gam wasn't just an iconic symbol or a useful tool, but one of the foundations of Mandalorian culture, and this was for 2 reasons. The first was simply that the armor was useful on the battlefield, while the second was that it helped create a shared cultural identity. While the first Mandalorians were all Tongs and later Mandalorians were mainly human, the Mandalorians were a multi-species culture, particularly after the reforms of Mandalore the Ultimate made it far easier for outsiders to become Mandalorians. Mandalorian armor helped ensure that all Mandalorians looked Mandalorian, regardless of their species or background, providing a degree of unity. Mandalorian armor was first developed after the Tong conquest of Mandalore circa 7000 BBY. After the Mandalorians conquered Mandalore and wiped out its native mythosaurs, their leader, Mandalore I, carved a mask for himself out of a mythosaur breastbone, and after the first Mandalorians discovered Beskar, the famed lightsaber-resistant Mandalorian iron, his followers began to forge masks of their own. Beskar was one of the toughest and most valuable metals in the galaxy, found only on Mandalore and its moon Concordia, and it was resistant to blaster bolts and even lightsaber strikes. Mandalorian metalsmiths developed ways of forging it that made it even tougher, adding carbons to the ore while it was being smelted to create a molecular cage that made the finished product lighter without reducing its durability. The Mandalorians used this processed Beskar to make masks after the example of Mandalore, and before long, they started making full suits of armor as well. The early generations of Mandalorians, the Mandalorian Crusaders, each wore unique, highly individualized sets of armor, which generally consisted of a mix of Beskar plates, often ornamented with spikes and bands of leather, and more flexible pieces made from other materials which were worn over a vacuum-sealed undersuit. The helmets of Crusader armor were typically angular and evoked Tong facial features, making them look quite a bit different from more modern sets of Mandalorian armor, but they did have one trait in common with the helmets of later years: their iconic T-visors. This style of armor was optimized for melee combat and designed to balance protection with maneuverability, reflecting how the Mandalorians typically fought at this time. The helmets of Crusader armor came with built-in life-supporting communication systems, as well as hoses that could connect to external air tanks for use in outer space, but the Mandalorian armor of this time was otherwise fairly low-tech. Later, during the lead-up to the Mandalorian Wars, Mandalorian armor design underwent drastic changes. Under Mandalore the Ultimate's Neo-Crusader reforms, the Mandalorians adopted a standardized armor design to promote uniformity, one that was more species-neutral than the heavily Tong-inspired aesthetics of Crusader armor. Neo-Crusader armor, also known as Mandalorian Shock Trooper armor, featured much more Beskar plating than Crusader armor had, giving it a total weight of 42 kilograms, making it much more protective at the cost of flexibility and weight. The armor consisted of mainly smooth, thick plates of Beskar over a padded undersuit, which protected Mandalorians from temperature extremes, vacuum, environmental hazards, and electrical damage. and it came with a unique teardrop-shaped helmet, which was actually just the beskar mask attached to a flexible hood. This helmet came equipped with an electronic heads-up displays, built-in comlinks, and life support systems. This armor came in different variants tailored to different species, and was often modified with concealed weapons, stealth field generators, or jetpacks. Neo-Crusader armor was also color-coded based on rank, with rank-and-file warriors wearing blue armor, frontline veterans wearing grey or silver armor, rally masters wearing red armor, and field marshals wearing gold armor. Eventually, this style of armor also fell out of favor. It was designed for the heavily armed shock troopers of the Mandalorian Wars, but as the Mandalorians declined and the way they fought shifted, the heavy Neo-Crusader kit became overly restrictive. Within a few centuries, Mandalorian armor had been trimmed down significantly, improving the wearer's maneuverability while still offering plenty of protection. Mandalorian armor seen during the Galactic Wars featured thick plating, but less of it than the Neo-Crusaders had worn. As the millennia wore on, Mandalorian armor would evolve further in that direction. As jetpacks became more central to how the Mandalorians fought and maneuverability became more of a focus, this necessitated a shift toward lighter armor. Over thousands of years, Mandalorian armor was trimmed down even further, and the result was the kind of Mandalorian armor you're likely most familiar with, Mandalorian Supercommando Armor. This class of armor became the standard during the reign of Mandalore the Uniter 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, and like shock trooper armor before it, it was ushered in as part of a sweeping series of reforms that revitalized Mandalorian culture, which the Mandalorians knew as the Return. It was sparser than previous forms of Mandalorian armor, but it also allowed for excellent maneuverability, and it could be customized with all manner of gadgets. In many respects, it was the best armor in the galaxy, and it's this version of Mandalorian armor that we're going to be looking at today. Modern Mandalorian Supercommando armor weighed about 10 kilograms, and a suit of it was valued at over 30,000 credits. Like previous versions of Mandalorian armor, it was built around a reinforced flight suit which offered plenty of protection in its own right. The flight suits of Mandalorian armor were often stiffened with beskar armor weave, which gave them significant protective capabilities, though not to the point of actual beskar plating. This was important as the sparser design of Supercommando armor left the flight suit exposed across much of the body, particularly the limbs. Like the undersuits of Crusader and Neo-Crusader armor, the flight suits of Supercommando armor could also be vacuum sealed, allowing the wearer to operate in space or underwater, and it provided minor protection against a variety of dangers, from laceration to extreme heat. It could only protect against so much though. Even those flight suits made with beskar armor weave were neither blaster nor lightsaber resistant, though they did likely have mild energy diffusing properties. Armor plates protecting the limbs attached directly to the flight suit, while the armor pieces protecting the torso were instead attached to a liner shirt worn over the flight suit, which provided an additional layer of protection. The liner shirt was thick and stiffer than the flight suit, as it incorporated 2 layers of ceramic plating and a micro-energy field projector, which made it much more protective than the flight suit and allowed it to diffuse energy from blaster shots. Along with the flight suit and liner shirt, the base layer of Mandalorian armor incorporated a set of gloves and a pair of high-traction combat boots, the latter of which were sometimes ornamented with merrill spikes meant to be used as close-range weapons. Of course, the most important part of Supercommando armor was the plating itself. Traditionally, the plating of Mandalorian armor was made from beskar alloyed with carbon and ceridium, which was light but incredibly durable, able to stand up to blaster fire and even stop a lightsaber blade. Some warriors opted for armor made with pure beskar, or beskar that was only alloyed with ceridium, which was far heavier but denser and more protective. But Mandalorians weren't always able to get their hands on beskar, especially in the modern era when the material was becoming rarer and more expensive. Thousands of years of mining began to exhaust Mandalore's beskar lodes, forcing the Mandalorians to start strip mining Concordia before the moon's lodes began to run dry too. By the time of the Clone Wars, Beskar mining had been in decline for centuries, and the metal was becoming much harder to obtain. The Empire later stripped Mandalore and Concordia of all the Beskar they had left, and it wasn't until after the Yuuzhan Vong War that the Mandalorians were able to find fresh Beskar loads again, thanks to the Vong blasting craters deep into Mandalore's crust. This shortage of Beskar prompted many Mandalorians to begin preserving suits of Beskar armor as family heirlooms, passing them down from generation to generation, and it forced those unable to get their hands on Beskar to make their armor out of lesser materials. Some non-Beskar Mandalorian armor sets were made from similarly exotic and highly durable metals, such as Stygian tryprismatic polymer or the naturally occurring alloy alum, while others were made from simple Durasteel or Duraplast. Jango Fett's armor was made from Durasteel, while Boba Fett enhanced parts of that armor with Duraplast, which was stronger. These lesser suits of Mandalorian armor were still very protective, able to stand up to blaster bolts and many other kinds of damage, but they were still inferior to Beskar armor, and they offered little to no protection against lightsaber blades. Regardless of the metal used, the design of the plates used in Supercommando armor was usually the same. Traditional Supercommando armor consisted of 25 plates plus the helmet, though by the time of the Clone Wars, most Mandalorians only wore 19 of these plates. 8 plates protected the legs. The Ketar Bure, or sabatons, were worn over the boots and protected the feet, while the Tandon Bure, or greaves, protected the shins and calves. Traditional Supercommando armor featured 2 sets of greaves, one for the front and one for the back, but most modern Mandalorians only wore the front Tandon Bure. Bes Levaik, or knee plates, protected the knees and often served as mounts for hidden weapons, while Moton Bure, or cuissards, protected the thighs and sometimes featured built-in blaster holders. Moton Bure varied in design, with some protecting the whole thigh and others only protecting part of the thigh, and some Mandalorians, such as Boba Fett, didn't use them at all, adding extra equipment pouches to their flight suits in their place. Parts of the Mandalorian kit that were paired, like all the leg plates, were referred to as Cal and Beskad plates, with the Cal plate being the left plate and the Beskad being the right plate. The Ven Kabur, or codpiece, protected the groin. Traditionally, it was paired with the Hatun Kabur, which protected the butt, but most Mandalorians went without it. The most dense concentration of plating in Supercommando armor was around the torso, which was protected by 6 armor plates attached to the aforementioned liner shirt. The Nor Kabur, or backplate, was the largest of these, and it protected the back. It usually featured attachment points for jetpacks and or oxygen tanks, and on older kinds of Mandalorian armor, the Nor Kabur also contained built-in temperature control systems. The other 5 torso plates were collectively termed the Halas, or Kureis, and it consisted of the Shartaz, or placard, which protected the stomach, the Getbur, or Gorget, which protected the upper chest, 2 Halkabur, or breastplates, which protected the chest, and the Kartar Beskar, or Tapul, also known as the Mandalorian Diamond, which sat over the breastbone and had an ornamental design. The fragmentary nature of the Kureis improved the armor's flexibility, but they still provided enough armoring to keep the wearer's torso well protected. The original Supercommando armor design also included a Jutni Getbur, or upper gorget, which protected the throat, but this was mostly dropped from modern armor due to how restrictive it could be. Some Mandalorians made use of it, however, most notably Boba Fett, who had watched his father die as a result of not wearing one. Also attached to the armor's liner were the Besmabure, or spolders, which protected the shoulders, while the armor's remaining arm pieces were worn separately. The spolders of Supercommando armor were much smaller than those of Crusader and Neo-Crusader armor, as previously large spolders were an important part of the Mandalorian design aesthetic. This design choice was dropped to reduce the weight of the Supercommando kit. The original Supercommando armor design, like with Neo-Crusader armor before it, included a pair of Shanbyor, or rarer braces, to protect the biceps, but these were dropped from modern armor, this time to improve maneuverability. This left just the Comrugs, or gauntlets, which protected the forearms and came with a knuckle plate to protect the back of the hands as well. Gauntlets were the most regularly modified piece of Mandalorian armor, as they made ideal attachment points for tools and concealed weapons. Of course, the most important part of the Mandalorian kit was the bysare, the helmet. With its smooth dome and T-visor, the modern Mandalorian helmet was the Mandalorian's most iconic symbol, and it fulfilled a wide variety of functions. Of course, the primary purpose of the helmet was protecting the head, and the dense layers of plating that made up the helmet and padding that cushioned the user's head against blunt force did that job well, but the helmet was also packed full of special features that gave it many other uses. For starters, the helmet, like the rest of the armor, could be vacuum sealed, allowing the wearer to operate in space or underwater, and it contained an energy supply of oxygen that could last for 2 hours. No external tanks needed. Even when the helmet wasn't sealed, its sophisticated environmental filters scrubbed pollutants and toxins from the air, allowing the wearer to operate long-term in contaminated environments. A built-in comlink and broadband antenna kept the wearer in contact with other Mandalorians, while high-definition sound sensors could be used to amplify or muffle sounds as the wearer needed. The helmet's visor had a night vision mode and automatic countermeasures to protect the wearer's eyes from bright flashes, and it had built-in macro binocular systems and a sophisticated heads-up display, which was tied into a variety of sensors and computer systems built into the helmet, giving the wearer a wealth of data about their surroundings at all times. These included infrared sensors, 360-degree motion sensors, a sophisticated battle computer that could track and highlight targets on the heads-up display, and even a set of pineal sensors and micro cameras which allowed the wearer to see directly behind them. Cooling vents on the back of the helmet kept heat from these systems from building up inside the helmet, and the helmet's various systems could be toggled or adjusted with voice commands, eye movements, or even blinking, allowing the wearer to adjust them even in the heat of combat. That's all just the base model too. Most Mandalorian helmets were upgraded with even more gadgets and special features. One of the most common modifications was the addition of a targeting rangefinder, usually mounted on an antenna on the right side of the helmet. The rangefinder could be flipped down the visor when in use and flipped up when not in use, and it provided the user with detailed targeting information on dozens of targets at once, allowing the wearer to track and more effectively eliminate a large number of opponents at once. Jango Fett also upgraded his helmet with a voice-controlled interface that allowed him to remotely operate Slave 1, voice control systems for his jetpack and concealed weapons suite, a video recording unit with playback and analysis features, additional infrared scanning lenses, fine-grained motion sensors, a more sophisticated sound amplification unit, and remote access to the HoloNet and other databases, which he could browse by using voice commands. These upgrades allowed Fett to easily and remotely control his whole arsenal, and they also greatly improved his awareness of his surroundings. Boba Fett crammed even more tech into the helmet, creating one of the most ridiculously sophisticated pieces of armor ever made. He upgraded the rangefinder to be able to track up to 30 targets at a time, upgraded the infrared scanning lenses, HoloNet and database search functions, and weapon control interfaces, and also added customized advanced penetrating radar lenses and olfactory sensors which could pick up on gases in such tiny quantities as just 1 part per billion and cross-reference them against a built-in scent database. Of course, Mandalorian armor was often modified in aesthetic ways as well as practical ones, often in accordance with clan traditions. Some wore plating of modified design, while others, particularly members of the Death Watch, used variant helmets which had the same features as standard helmets, but sometimes drastically different design. The early Death Watch used stylized helmets with elongated faces, ornamental horns above the brow ridge, and blockier, more compact T-visors, though they later switched to more conventional helmet designs. The followers of Darth Maul during the Clone Wars soldered medals of brakhorns onto their helmets in imitation of their leader. Other Mandalorians customized their armor in simpler ways, painting their armor in a variety of colors or emblazoning them with symbols. Traditionally, many armor colors had special meanings in Mandalorian culture. Mandalorians that were mourning a lost loved one painted their armor gray, while others painted their armor red to honor a parent. Black was used to represent justice, gold was used to represent vengeance, green was used to represent duty, blue was used to represent reliability, and orange was used to represent a lust for life. Of course, armor color didn't always carry these meanings. Sometimes, Mandalorians painted their armor a certain color just because they liked that color, or because the color instead represented their clan or their rank within it. In some cases, Mandalorian armor was painted in camouflage patterns to match the current terrain, though this was rare as the Mandalorians usually operated according to the saying that it's one thing to see us coming, and it's another thing to do something about it. Mandalorians also decorated their armor with a variety of insignia. Traditionally, unit insignia were emblazoned on the right spolder, while clan sigils or personal marks were emblazoned on the left spolder. Other symbols were emblazoned on the helmet and cuirass, among them Jaegais, traditionally worn on the helmet, the iconic mythosaur skull, the sigil of the Mandalorians, ancient symbols of the Mandalorian Crusaders or Neo-Crusaders, and more modern faction symbols such as the sigil of the Death Watch or the Journeyman Protectors. Some Mandalorians wore capes or cloaks with their armor, some for purely aesthetic reasons and others for practical reasons. The leader of the Death Watch traditionally wore a shoulder cape emblazoned with the faction's sigil, for example, and many similar shoulder capes were worn by many other Mandalorians, including Boba Fett. Fett, and many others, also sometimes wore trophies taken from the foes they slew. In Fett's case, this included braids made from the pelts of slain Wookiees. Most Mandalorians upgraded their armor with at least a few accessories. All Mandalorians wore utility belts with their armor, which typically included pouches for ammo, emergency rations, and other useful supplies. Sometimes, these belts came with holsters for blasters, used instead of or alongside holsters built into the armor's thigh plates, while others came with kummers, a traditional Mandalorian battle skirt. Typically made of sturdy leather, the kummer was a flexible, blast-dampening skirt that gave the wearer extra leg protection, as it could disperse energy to an extent, provided protection from shrapnel and debris, and, most importantly to Mandalorians, provided protection against downwash from a jetpack's rockets. In the modern era, jetpacks were considered a fundamental part of the Mandalorian kit, and nearly all modern Mandalorians incorporated one into their armor. The Mandalorians had used the jetpack since the time of the Crusaders, who adopted them after early engagements with the Republic Army's famed rocket jumpers. But during the Crusader and Neo-Crusader periods, jetpacks remained somewhat rare as they were made redundant by the feared Basilisk war droids. It was only after the Basilisks were scrapped at the close of the Mandalorian Wars that Mandalorians began to use jetpacks more extensively. By the time of Mandalore the Uniter, they had become very popular among the Mandalorians, to the point that Supercommando Armor was partly designed around them. Jetpacks provided Mandalorians with exceptional maneuverability, allowing them to rapidly advance or retreat, as well as strike from angles they otherwise couldn't. They were one of the most versatile tools, useful for tasks as mundane as scaling a cliff, or as specialized as staying out of a Jedi's lightsaber range. Many modern Mandalorian fighting techniques were built around the use of jetpacks, and modern Mandalorian battle strategies often relied heavily on jetpack-wearing air cavalry. Modern Mandalorian backplates were designed with attachment points for jetpacks, even for Mandalorians that didn't actually wear jetpacks themselves. Most Mandalorians used one of two models of jetpack: the Trinamon Transport's Z6 jetpack and the Merson Munitions JT-12 jetpack. The JT-12 was the more common of the two. Indeed, it was one of the galaxy's most popular jetpack models in general. Propelled by adjustable twin rockets mounted to the side of the pack, the JT-13 was designed for speed and maneuverability during flight, capable of propelling a Mandalorian at speeds of up to 145 km per hour. Its central fuel tank could hold enough fuel for a minute of continuous operation, or, if used as recommended, 23-second blasts, each of which could propel the wearer 100 meters horizontally or 70 meters vertically. Additional fuel bladders could be carried to allow the jetpack to operate for longer, but this increased the user's weight and thus diminished the jetpack's utility. The JT-12 also featured a built-in missile launcher designed for a single MM9 concussion rocket, which had explosive power comparable to a powerful grenade. This launcher could also be used to launch non-standard ordnance, such as anti-vehicle grapplers or the fine-bore missiles Mitronomon designed for the Z6 jetpack. Speaking of, the Z6 jetpack had a similar design and similar capabilities to the JT-12, though it was more versatile in some respects. It was propelled by two highly adjustable side-mounted rocket thrusters which featured oxygen intakes to mix with the pack's fuel to generate thrust. Like the JT-12, the Z6 only carried enough fuel for a minute's continuous operation or 23-second bursts, and each burst could propel the wearer 100 meters horizontally or 70 meters vertically. The Z6 was designed to be operated via remote controls, usually built into a Mandalorian's gauntlet or helmet. It featured a gyro stabler to provide counter thrust during landings, as well as a missile launcher designed for a grappling hook or a powerful anti-vehicle fine-bore homing missile. Of course, Mandalorians also modified their armor with tons of hidden weapons, which were often built into the gauntlets, though they could also be added to other armor plates. The most common gauntlet weapons were retractable blades and flamethrowers, which were useful for catching opponents off guard. Retractable blades came in a variety of styles. Most of the time, they were vibroblades designed for stabbing or slashing, and they were used to kill or seriously wound opponents that got too close for comfort. Usually, the housing for these blades was concealed, allowing them to be used as a surprise weapon. Jango Fett had a set of serrated retractable blades built into his tight gauntlet, which could be shot out at targets as well as used for slashing. Flamethrowers were usually less discreet. Many flamethrower models were used by Mandalorians, but the most popular, employed by Jango and Boba Fett, was the Zerka Arms ZX miniature flame projector, which was small enough to be easily mounted on a gauntlet, but powerful enough to pose a serious threat. Designed to be mounted on the wrist and connected to a fuel tank worn on the back by a cable, this flamethrower could create a 5-meter long and 1-meter wide cone of fire, and its blast was intense enough to be able to set a target's clothes on fire pretty much instantly. The ZX flamethrower could be used to kill a target, but it was more commonly used for area control, and it proved especially useful against Jedi. The Fetts had one of these mounted on their left gauntlet, and Boba Fett modified his to draw from his jetpack fuel supply to avoid having to carry an additional fuel bladder for it. Many Mandalorians housed compact blasters in their gauntlets, sometimes even relying on them instead of handheld weapons. Death Watch Supercommandos were known to make extensive use of wrist blasters, and Boba Fett also incorporated a Blastech DIR-24 wrist laser into his right gauntlet, housing it above his flamethrower. This compact but intensely powerful weapon packed the firepower of a light blaster rifle into a smaller package, but this came at the cost of range. The DIR-24 was only effective at ranges of up to 50 meters, and it was difficult to aim. That was a common trend with these sorts of weapons, and that meant that, like many typical Mandalorian gauntlet weapons, they were best used at close range. Handheld blasters were generally more useful, and Mandalorians primarily used theirs as a fallback weapon, using their wrist blasters when they were disarmed or if a target got too close for a larger blaster to be used effectively. Many Mandalorians, including Jango Fett, made use of wrist-mounted dart launchers compatible with a variety of dart types, which could be used to incapacitate or kill a target. Fett was also known to use Kaminoan saber darts with his dart launcher, using their fast-acting poison to kill Zam Wesell after she was captured by the Jedi. Flechette launchers were also popular, and Death Watch leader Pre Vizsla even had a concealed launcher for razor-sharp circular saws, which he used against Darth Maul during their duel for the title of Mandalore. These weapons were typically used to wound or distract rather than kill, and they were excellent for catching opponents off guard. Whipcord or snare launchers were also popular, used mainly by Mandalorians who made a living as bounty hunters, as the Fetts did. The Fetts had a whipcord launcher built into their right gauntlet, which fired a fiber cord whip tipped with a grappling hook. These cords were usually self-propelling, wrapping around and entangling a target as soon as they made contact. The way this worked is unknown. Whipcord launchers were an extremely effective way to subdue a target, and if a Mandalorian's jetpack was out of fuel or a greater degree of stealth was necessary, they could also be used as conventional grappling hooks. One of the most powerful and one of the least subtle Mandalorian armor weapons were miniature rocket launchers, which were used to fire low-yield wrist rockets. Typically, these rockets weren't any more powerful than your average grenade, and they were often used to incapacitate targets by blasting them off their feet, rather than being used to kill them directly, though they could certainly do that too. The Kelvarak Consolidated Arms MM9 Mini Concussion Rocket Launcher was especially popular among Mandalorians, with the Fets incorporating one into their right gauntlet. It came equipped with a remote guidance system that allowed rockets to hone in on their targets, as well as a stiff plate that extended over the hand, preventing it from flexing too far back so as to keep users from accidentally blowing their own hands off. The MM9 could carry one rocket at a time, and its payloads varied. It could fire dumbfire missiles, but it was meant for use with homing missiles, as its built-in tracking computers could interface with the missile's targeting system to guide it to a predetermined target. The Fets typically used Lockris Syndicated Securities Type 12A anti-personnel rockets, a type of compact but powerful concussion rocket, with their MM9s. Other popular choices included the Lockris Syndicated Securities Type 12B holotip rocket, which was designed to release clouds of nerve agents or other forms of poison gas upon detonation, and the Merson Munitions 1126 rocket, another kind of concussion rocket. The Fets and some other Mandalorians also incorporated rocket launchers into their knee plates for added firepower. These knee-pad rocket dart launchers could each fire a pair of tiny rocket darts, which, despite their size, were powerful enough to kill a target if they struck them directly. How these were meant to be activated is unknown, but the Fets had all their weapons synced to their helmet so they could operate them with voice commands. This wide variety of random weapons actually played a key role in modern Mandalorian fighting tactics, and they were especially essential in combat with Jedi or other Force wielders. While a popular misconception claims that the Mandalorians' preferred solution to fighting Jedi was to use slug throwers, it was actually this varied arsenal of random nonsense that helped them hold their own against Force wielders. The Mandalorians had learned through the millennia that relying on any one weapon or strategy against the Jedi was doomed to end in failure. No one weapon was a trump card against the power of the Force. The key to fighting Jedi, and a useful strategy for fighting in general, was to constantly keep the opponent off balance and to maintain the element of surprise, and that's what all these weapons were meant to accomplish. They destabilized, distracted, and disoriented the enemy, allowing them to be more easily subdued or killed. When combined with judicious use of the jetpack, which could keep Mandalorians safely out of lightsaber range and help them outmaneuver and further disorient their opponents, this arsenal made the Mandalorians unpredictable and thus difficult to fight, even for a Jedi. So, that's our look at modern Mandalorian Supercommando Armor, one of the most intricate and iconic pieces of equipment in the Star Wars galaxy. But what do you think? What version of Mandalorian armor is your favorite? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.